Okay, if this doesn't work, you're probably not going to hear this because this is actually my third time trying to do this video, and it's crashed twice now at the end of my two previous recordings. Okay, this is Roger Capello bringing you my week at the club. Not in the happiest frame of mind, but hopefully I'll get happier as I look at the game. Bringing you the action from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. This week with my game against Jim Hankard in the Reggie Boone Memorial. And first I'd like to talk about this object called Ultimate Tool that's been in the news lately as the New Horizons mission has flown by it. Quite a navigation feat, and I talked about it previously in episode 37. Back then it wasn't called Ultimate Tool yet. It was 2014 MU69. And it's a Kuiper Belt object. It's a very primitive body that's been orbiting out there since the origin of the solar system about 4.5 billion years ago. And it's hoped that it will yield some interesting science because it's more pristine than things that are in the inner solar system where they are subject to collision with other meteorites and so on. It stays fairly well isolated. An interesting sidelight to or footnote to this is that I used to have a brass quintet called the Planetary Brass Quintet, and the tuba player for that quintet, Mark Peterson, recently posted on Facebook that he had been posted a picture actually of him and his wife with Brian May, who's a guitarist for Queen. And Brian May is an astrophysicist, has a PhD, and was actually at Johns Hopkins for the flyby and premiered a song that he had created for the event. Anyhow, Mark got to talking to him and told him that back when we had our brass quintet that I had arranged a version of Bohemian Rhapsody for our brass quintet. And I guess he was somewhat intrigued by that. So it was a funny little cross connection there that happened. Anyhow, moving along, because I am running out of patience anyhow, in this game against Jim, this is sort of a mirror image of the game we played 5 weeks ago in the first round of the last tournament. Jim had black in that case. And what happened is that he adopted a hippopotamus defense. And in this case, he sort of adopted a hippopotamus attack. And I won't describe each of the moves because basically he's getting to a tableau of pieces, a setup, like so, that is, I'll go one more move there, that is, is the same whether he's white or black. It's just with the colors reversed. Where he has taken, laid claim to the first three ranks, and actually in good control over the fourth as well, and said, I'm in a shell here, come get me. So if you actually look at the squares that are covered there by his pieces, those are all the squares that are attacked. The only square on his side of the board that he doesn't have under control is where his bishop is on B2. On the other hand, if you look at black's, similar control, I have a few holes in my side of the board, but I have better, I have more space, and therefore I have control over these squares on my fifth rank. So it's actually a space advantage for black. And of course the idea here, as I described in that last video, was that since I have a space advantage, I should go ahead and use that space advantage to maneuver and try to keep from launching a premature a premature offensive in the center that would give him the opportunity to make use of his pieces. That is, don't take the fight to him until I'm really as well lined up as I can possibly be with my pieces. So maybe double my rook, something like that. I never actually got a chance to do that. So after I played rook to d8, he got his queen off of the file. I added one more piece to control this c4 square. That's so his knight can't make use of it, because I thought that f4 might be coming, in which case I wanted to be able to respond with d4, and upon his locking up with those central pawns, I wanted to make sure that this this c4 square was covered by pawn. So I actually have control now over this c4 square. Also, I might, with a little bit of preparation, I might be pushing that pawn in the future. Right now, he's got it a bit locked down, but that's the way from that pawn break is how I can advance on the queen side. However, he was threatening to play to f5, so first I played my queen back to get enough control over this f5 square so that he can't immediately push that pawn. And also at the same time, I had a double attack on this h3 square. So his king went ahead and defended that square. Then I made a mistake. And the mistake is to play knight to h5. And the reason I made a mistake is because I was looking at a line that involved him attacking the knight, in which case I was willing to go ahead and take his pawn. And this actually wins a pawn, because if he takes back like so, trades the knights, and now he can't take this with his rook because of the pin, right? If he takes the pawn, there's a pin winning the exchange. So that wouldn't be good for him. What I missed when I played knight to h4 was him simply not making that move, and instead preparing to advance further on the queen side. And so with this situation, I decided that, since he's building up on the king side, that I need to have a counterattack on the queen side. So first I put an additional control on my pawn, so that if my knight has to come back and interrupt the defense of my bishop on this e-pawn, that it would be controlled by my queen and knight. And he, incidentally, putting a third attack on this f4 pawn, this forced a response by him, but actually it's a good response, which is to play his bishop to c1. His bishop wasn't doing very much, looking along the spine of my pawns, whereas on c1 now it actually contributes not only to the defense of f4, but at some point it's threatening to come over here and operate on these dark squares on the king side. It adds into his attack. So it sort of forced him to improve his position. So I really don't have time to sit around. I need to do something. I can't break in the center, and it's clear that my forces are poised to best operate on the queen side, with my bishops pointed over in that direction and my pawn formation. So I went ahead and pushed my d-pawn. He can't really win this d-pawn now, because if, right now, I would take twice, so no, so he can't. So he can't win. I'm thinking of a point a few more moves on. So let's go on. I went ahead and played the pawn up. He advanced his knight, and now he's threatening to trade off this bishop, and also to use that knight, or possibly to use, if he doesn't trade off the bishop, to use a knight to support h7. So if I retreat my bishop, for example, to d7, then I was worried about things such as him advancing that pawn, and my knight, if it goes forward, for example, he could trade that off, and this is looking very bad for me, because who knows, if I play knight like so, he can play his queen out. Starting to get a lot of pressure on h7. Now in this position I might be able to play h6, but there are starting to be real possibilities with that knight parked on g5, and so I didn't want to leave didn't want to leave him with that knight on g5 when he went there, and I wasn't sure that he would trade off my bishop, so I didn't really have time just to go ahead and play pawn takes pawn. So instead I forced matters with h6, realizing that it could result in a weak pawn structure for me. But the nice thing is that the g and the e pawn are both exerting a control now over f5. So that slows down his attack and allows me to have a little more time for my queenside attack. On the other hand, he's able to attack my knight, and now my knight doesn't have, in this position, I can't take on f4 because it's still defended by the pawn. And I overlooked this move, and I have to retreat my knight back. And now that allows him to just go ahead and keep advancing kingside pawns. So it seemed to me I couldn't afford to have that pawn phalanx going any further, so I exchanged off a pair of pawns, and after his bishop took back, luckily I can interpose my pawn, and his bishop could have gone to g3 and stayed on the same diagonal as my queen, but he chose instead to stay on the diagonal that is putting pressure over my h6 square, tempting me to play f3 here with my c3 with my c pawn, which, if I'd done that, it looks like it makes sense because he only has one square to go back to, and now his queen side is a little awkward, but I can't stop him from playing a4, and if I do something like a5 and he plays a4 and I try to block a4, now my bishop is really in tune behind these dark squared pawns. I've made this an incredibly bad piece, and if I don't do that, then his bishop is going to, like if I exchange pawns or something like that, then his bishop will, at some point here, be able to come to a3 and do some good things along that diagonal. So pushing the c pawn I didn't like, just on basic positional grounds. So instead, let's scroll this up a bit. Instead, I played my king to h7, tucking it in that safe little fortress. He moved his knight to bring it closer to my king, hitting these two squares that are highlighted. Of course, my pawn is defending both of those squares, so either, if he wants to go there, either has to sack the piece or run his h-pawn up. He chose not to, not to do that, obviously. It's my move, and at some point he might do that. I played knight to d7. The idea here is, so on this square, my knight is also hurting for, is controlled by his pawns. The squares I would like to are controlled. Whereas when I reposition it, I'm going to go through this f5, through the c5 square, and threaten to do things on the queen side, and then end up, as you'll see, I'll make a move here. He played queen e2, and I played the knight to c4. So not only threatening the pawn on b3 a second time that he presumably has to do something about, but also threatening to maneuver my knight now through e6 to f4, where I can take up a very strong post. So since that pawn was attacked twice, he exchanged it off. Now at this point, he could try taking it the other way. He actually thought for quite a while about this move, and I think maybe he was considering this. I was hoping that he was, because this would have been bad for him. I mean, it looks like it's good, because if I simply took back, he would take back with the queen here, and now he's he's won the pawn, and his queen is threatening to do some nasty things on my queen side. But the problem is I'm not obliged to take his pawn back, and instead what I was planning to do was just to push my pawn, and now his queen's under attack. His best move is just go ahead and take the pawn. Now my best move, according to Stockfish, is to just play rook takes pawn. Okay, but that wasn't what I was planning. My idea was to play the knight into d4, and then after his queen moves somewhere, I can win the pawn on b3. So this was very good for black. Anyhow, that little trap he did not fall into. Instead, he took with the b pawn, and I have nothing better than to complete the exchange. Okay, this allows him then to pin my knight to my rook, and I didn't want to trade it off immediately because I wanted to resolve this pawn situation. So I made a Zwischenzug, trading off the pair of pawns. He had to take back here because his queen is under attack. And then I have time to take his bishop. He takes my knight back. And then my knight moves to where it wanted to go anyhow. Let me go back move, threatening to come into f4 on my next move. Of course, he saw this, and he doesn't have to sit around and wait for me to make that move with tempo. Instead, he makes a move with tempo. queen to a2, attacking, basically he's forking my pieces, attacking the a2 pawn a second time, and attacking this knight on e6 as well. So I have to do something. I can't make any move that defends both of those threats, but I can make a counter threat, which of course is what I wanted to do anyhow, and which is to move my knight into f4. That allows him, if he wants to go ahead and win my a pawn, giving up his d pawn, but that would be bad for him, because if he took the pawn, instead of exchanging off the queens and inviting his rook down to the 7th rank and then winning the pawn, instead I would have the better plan of queen to c2 check, infiltrating his position here, and then I could play. I could have my choice of e pawn or h pawn, and they're both good. So this actually would have been a good position for me. He did not do that. Back in this position, he instead played his bishop to defend the d pawn that I was attacking, and that it turns out that's not the most. That's not the best way to defend the pawn. It's a little awkward. There was no really good way to defend it. He could have played his a rook over to defend the pawn, or defended it with his queen on b1. This way, this bishop is going to end up being a target and keeps his knight from maneuvering through that square. So I had time then to double on my 7th rank and keep him from winning this a pawn. And he sensed that I might be doubling my rooks on the f file, so he went ahead and proceeded to double his rooks on the f file as well. And about this point, I realized that it had been a mistake to double my rooks, because, given his response, because now if my knight moves, this rook here that's highlighted is attacked 3 times by his 2 rooks and queen, and I'd actually lose material. So my knight is pinned, and I want to get that. I want to unpin it. So instead, I decided to put the rooks where they really should be on the c file, and I started maneuvering to do that. So I played my queen to c3. He dropped his queen back to give a second defense to this b pawn or d pawn that I'm now attacking twice. Gives me time to get my rook onto that file, and that keeps him from now playing rook to c1, which is nice about it. And for some reason, he played queen to d1. I'm not sure why. Possibly just to get another defense on his bishop, or to support the h5 square after the pawn pushes twice. I'm not sure, but it's a mistake, because it allows me simply to take the b pawn. And now I have a passed a pawn that's really a winning advantage. He decided to try to trade off the queens at this point. But, I'm not obliged to trade off the queens at all. I can retreat my queen. And furthermore, I can come to this e7 square, threatening to come to h4 in my next move with an unstoppable attack on h3 with knight and queen. But he has one move to prepare for it, and he has a very good preparing move, which is what he did. He played his rook to c1. At least what seemed like a very good preparing move. It turns out that this is not so good, because I actually had a combination here, and I won't see. Let me hide it. Maybe a little too late if you were looking ahead. I missed the combination. I have an excuse for missing the combination. You always have an excuse, and I'm sticking to mine, and that's that on my last move there, on queen d7, I handed my book over to Paul Godin, who was watching the game. He had finished up very early, and I was short on time. I had under 5 minutes, and according to the rules, I can have somebody else keep score. I didn't want to lose the score of the rest of the game, and he graciously obliged me by keeping score for me. But because of that, I was that, and the fact that I did only have 4 minutes and 51 seconds, I sort of rushed my next move, and I missed a combination. And I did a very sensible thing. I doubled rooks, but doubling the rooks on the c file is not the best move here. And by now you've probably seen it. If you want to pause your video, you can go ahead and do that and try to find out what the best move is. Okay, well, It's, as you probably saw, it would have been rook takes rook. And because when he takes back with the queen, then I have this nice move, knight takes pawn, forking the queen and the rook. And no matter which way, what he does, he's lost here. If he plays rook takes rook, I'll simply take his queen. If he takes my bishop, the rook is, the discovered attack on the rook is was undefended, and it comes with check. His king has to move, and then my rook can actually fork his bishop and knight. And Stockfish evaluates it at -15. And that's true whether he gives up the queen or goes down this line. So it would have been very bad, and the game would have been over quickly. I didn't see that. Instead, I doubled the rooks. Not a bad move. Like I said, it does allow him to trade off a pair of rooks. But I was happy to do that. Then he has a chance to retreat the bishop off that square and put it on a better square. Sensible move, but of course that allows me to continue on with my penetration on the c-file. He is able to force a trade of rooks, but I want the trade to be on my own terms. It's almost always better for someone else to initiate a trade because it brings your pieces forward rather than you trading and bringing his pieces forward. And so he did that, and I went forward. I like the idea of advancing my queen better than, I could have gotten it. If I'd taken with my d pawn, I could have gotten another passed pawn here. But doing so didn't look as strong to me. I just like this idea much better of getting my queen and knight into an attack, because his king looked a little weak, and those are very strong pieces together. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. He pushed his h-pawn, which is a bit of a mistake. I mean, he needs, understandably, he wants to pry open my king side, but this leads to quite a forcing loss to him, because I can simply intrude into his position with the queen d2 check, and his king has to go back to the bank rank. Well, I mean, it doesn't have to. He could have played bishop to g2, but that would have been checkmate then. If his bishop went here, I would have simply played queen takes bishop checkmate. So instead he played king to h1, and now I'm able to go yet further into his position and attack the knight, and now this knight doesn't have any square to go to, because there's no way to defend it, and the squares it would escape to are all governed by my pieces. This one I have 2 attacks on, and he only has 1 defense. So he's going to lose the knight no matter what he does. So he decided to sell it as dearly as possible, and I went ahead and obliged him by taking it with a pawn. But that allows me to have a series of checks here. I win his h-pawn, he moves, I check, he moves, and now I can maneuver in and threaten checkmate on g1. He could block on g2, that leads to a forced mate. You can look at it in the notes there if you want to, or try to find it on your own. It would have been a fairly easy line to go down, because that's my next move. It's obviously going to be knight f2 check, and to maneuver through g4. He didn't do that. Instead, he just traded the knight off. But it's getting easier and easier for black to play, which is a good thing, because I got down to about a minute to play, and I'm able to handle this with 1 minute. So I started pushing my h-pawn, because with my queen can't mate on its own, but the queen and pawn together can. Also, it gives my king a way to escape out of its box if necessary. Also, it gives my bishop a pathway here to come in on the dark squares and help if necessary. So it does a number of good things. He took over the second rank, but that gives me the first rank. I mean, there's really just not enough. He doesn't have enough control over the squares. I check him, he has to come up, and now this pawn can actually contribute to the attack by coming up to where I'm now threatening on g3. He decides to attack my king, threatening to advance his f-pawn, and I have a possible checkmate. But I have this little maneuver of checking him on g3. He doesn't want to put his king in the corner, because then I'll be threatening checkmate myself after h3. So instead he goes to f1, but I can take the pawn and check him, and then come back and check him again. Okay, and then I can push my pawn one more time. It's now threatening to become a queen very soon. But he goes to where he's threatening either to, if my queen moves away, to checkmate me on g7, or since this bishop is pinned, possibly to push his pawn all the way to f8 and become a queen or a knight check, something like that. He doesn't have time to do that. Now, in this position, since I only had a minute, I didn't analyze very deeply, and I realized that h2 probably led to a quick checkmate, because there's no way to stop me getting a second queen. But I didn't want to take a chance with his queen, with any kind of forcing move sequence that he might make. And so instead I went ahead and checked him. But what could have happened was I could have played h2, would have been the best possible move. And if he tried to go ahead and get a queen, now that leads, after the king moves to the only square, that leads to checkmate. And if he, takes my bishop here with check or something like that, I can simply take back, and he takes back, and now I don't play king takes pawn. Instead, I just play the pawn up and get a queen. So it's trivial win. So I checked him. Instead of moving away and letting me, take the f pawn here, if he played his king to e1, I was just going to play the queen back and take on f1, on f6. And then he'd getting rid of his threats, but instead he went the other way, which just leads to a checkmate. Either way, it was a lost position. So that was the end of the game, and hopefully it's not going to crash on me this time. I went through a little quicker, and probably not as cheerfully this time as I did the previous two times, but there's a limit. And the first time was yesterday, actually. I tried to record now once this morning, and now the second time. We'll see if this actually makes it through and finds its way to YouTube. So this is Roger Capello saying so long. See you next week in my week at the club. Bye-bye.